Let's go fishing nude. Ain't nobody hanging round. Let's go fishing nude. Hey, Fish Nerd Nation, this is Crappie Hippie, your tree-hugging redneck from eastern Kansas. And I have a fish in the news story for y'all come out of the Salina Post, November 17th, 2019. And what the story is about is the 10-year assessment of the early spawn bass program in Kansas. Early spawn bass program, what the heck is that? I don't know. I didn't know until the other day when I ran across this article. But here we go. The early spawn bass program is a way that the people that run the hatchery ponds manipulate the bass into spawning up to 60 days earlier than they usually do. Well, Crappie Hippie, who are these people? Who are you talking about? I am talking about the hardworking people at the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism, the KDWP. We don't call it the DNR in Kansas. We used to call it KDW, Kansas Department of Wildlife. But then they gave them more to do, so it became KDWP, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. And then, of course, they cut their budget and gave them fewer people and gave them more to do, and it became the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism, which is pretty ridiculous. But they hold up well, and they're doing great things for the bass fishing in the state of Kansas. Okay, so what about the early spawn bass program? Why do we need such a thing? Well, Doug Nygren, the Fisheries Division Director for KDWPT, explains it this way. We've been stocking bass in these reservoirs for decades, and some of them they just won't take. Same's true in a lot of the state lakes. We just don't get good bass fishing. In fact, really, only 4 reservoirs in this state were really rated as good to excellent bass fishing out of all the reservoirs in the state. And what they found, looking into cause and effect, is that in a lot of reservoirs, especially reservoirs where gizzard shad make up 90% or more of the forage base, is that the bass were not getting big enough by wintertime to overwinter. So the average bass going into winter in Kansas was 4 or 5 inches long, and the way the gizzard shad grow so fast, they are not big enough to take advantage of that as forage. So unless there's a secondary forage base for these smaller bass to use, they're not able to make it through the wintertime. And so once they figured this out, they came out with a neat solution on how to get the bass bigger come December. Okay, so what they discovered at the Mead Fish Hatchery, the manager there, Jason Vanyar, and I hope I'm pronouncing this gentleman's name correctly, they developed a method for manipulating both photo day and temperature. And what that does is trick the bass in the brood ponds into thinking it's May when it's only March. So they go ahead and spawn, and now the bass are, an inch, inch and a half, 2 inches bigger when they go to put them in the lakes in May. So they put them in ahead of even the local bass spawn or the naturalized bass spawn. And that assures they have a generation of bass that instead of being 4 or 5 inches come the end of December, they're pushing, 8 inches or more. And a fish that size can handle a 2, 3, even 4-inch gizzard shad, whereas a 4-inch fish, just has trouble eating a 3-inch fish. That's just the way it goes. And it's just been phenomenal. They've put in over 2 million of these early bass program bass in the past 10 years. And the number of reservoirs that have gone from poor bass fishing or non-existent bass fishing to good or excellent has doubled. So we used to have 4 lakes, now we have 9 that are rated good to excellent. And I'm not going to throw a lot of names around, but you can just, out there at Webster Reservoir, Kerwin Reservoir, these lakes were bass deserts. They basically didn't have any kind of functioning bass population whatsoever. So it's really exciting to see the bass get enhanced in several lakes and for them to come back strong and actually survive in a big way in a couple others where the bass fishing was basically non-existent. Now, in addition to the early spawn bass program, what they've done is enhance cover in older reservoirs by putting in lots and lots of cedar trees, because out here in eastern Kansas, cedars can be a nuisance tree. We don't have the fire, and burn down in the summer like we did back in in the natural days, where the prairie grass would catch on fire and the little cedars would burn up, and that would control their growth. So we have lots of places where cedars need to be cut, and the KDWPT grabs them sometimes and takes them on out to the lakes and makes the cedar piles. But of course, natural materials don't last, and there's been a big push to put out these artificial reefs, these artificial habitats called Georgia cubes, which are kind of just slatted plastic cubes that can be arranged just like a kid playing with blocks. They can be stacked, they can be staggered, they can be broken down into little units or made into, one long train of a unit. But they create not only just little individual brush piles, but these fish cities with them, with 20 or more cubes in a city. And that not only benefits the bass, but benefits a lot of other fish as well. See, that's the thing. A lot of people, when we go out of our way, like Bass Angler Sportsman Society has been a huge help in getting these 2,000-some Georgia cube fish habitats put into these lakes. And, they're just doing it to help the bass. Well, maybe they are just doing it to help the bass, but they can't just help the bass in isolation. These cubes are providing habitat not only for spawning bait fish, but for other game species like catfish and crappie, things like crawdads and so forth, the zooplankton, the microbiology, the protozoan level biology there, all benefiting from the restoration of habitat into these lakes. So we talked about artificial reefs and artificial cover, man-made materials for restoring habitat in episode 213. And as usual, we kind of came down on it depends and who's doing it and how. But they can be a good thing, especially we're in a state like ours where our outdoor department is notoriously short of people and money. And the exciting thing that I'm just going to add as I wind this up, not only are we just completely stoked to see that the early spawn bass program has done so well, but this last spring and early summer was fantastic because it rained so much around here that they had to hold all the federal reservoirs up because, remember, these federal reservoirs are primarily there for flood control, okay? Fishing is just a side benefit of the whole deal. And they had to hold them up during most of walleye spawn, all the crappie spawn, and all the bass spawn. So nobody was out on the lake. No one was molesting the bass and crappie on their beds, taking them off their beds. So not only did we not lose any spawning bedding fish to anglers, we did not pull the males off the nests, so the nests had a higher survivability. And there was no one, out there on the post spawn and so forth. So we had this big chunk of prime time where anglers could not get at the fish. And so now we've got these lakes that have these incredible bass populations, and they've had this wonderful spring spawn where they could pull it off basically unmolested. And we're going to be looking forward to 3, 4, 5 years of really good crappie, walleye, and bass fishing here in Kansas, not to mention other species like catfish and so on. So, excited in Kansas? Yes, we are. Assessment, 10-year assessment of the early spawn bass program shows that it was effort well done and money well spent. This has been Crappie Hippie, your tree-hugging redneck from eastern Kansas, saying tight lines and Valentines. Peace out.
News, fish in the news. Everybody loves their fish in the news.
Food, fish are made out of food. Vegan shark, you're really dumb. Fish are made out of food.